Okay, for the last few weeks we've been doing the AOH on the $2 Tuesday tutorial. We've been doing the AOH drawing method, where if you can write the letters A, O, and H, then you can draw a triangle, a circle, and a rectangle. And if you can draw a triangle, a circle, and a rectangle, then you can make a cone, a sphere, and a column. And if you can make a cone, a sphere, and a column, then you can draw anything in the world. We demonstrated it by doing a quick cat. We spent some time talking about shading of a cone. We've spent some time talking about the shading of a sphere, and this is upside down. We've spent some time talking about the shading of a column. This week, these videos should all still be available on YouTube until the end of the week when I'm going to take them down. This week, I want to demonstrate how the shadows react to one another. So I'm going to turn off all the excess lights so that you only have the one light source, so that you can see how the objects, as we discussed in the, like for instance with the sphere, as we discussed before in the sphere, how you have the bright spot, you have the texture, creating a shadow on itself, so that you have a transition. Then you have a shadow of that the body casts on itself. Then you have the backlit side, where the light is bouncing off the paper and reflecting back up on the back side over here. Ooh, moving around. And then when you look at the shadow itself, the cast shadow, you can see where it's darkest right here underneath where there's no light. Then you can see where light is bouncing off of the object back into the center of the shadow. Then you can see a reflection of the dark line here on the outer edge of the shadow. Okay, that was the shading of the sphere. Now, what happens when you put the sphere next to a cone? This might be a little difficult to demonstrate, but when the shadows are cast around the cone, look at what happens. First off, you can see there's two things to notice about our cone. The first thing to notice about our cone is because our cone has a reflective surface. Hang on, I'm trying to zoom in on it. Because our cone has a reflective surface, it has two demarcations on it. One, you have where the shadow is blocked. You have where the light is blocked by the object, but light is still bending around to reflect in it. And then you have here, you have an actual reflection of the sphere on the cone. So you have a reflection and a shadow. And the thing to notice about the shadow is how the shadow bends around the cone in a cone shape. How it combines the shapes of the sphere and the cone. The same is true if you take the sphere and the column. If you take the sphere next to the column, the shadow follows the shape of the column. If you put the column in front of the sphere, the shadow takes the shape of the sphere. See what it's doing? The shadow curves. The shadow curves around the object. The cone, the column, and the sphere and the triangle. Try to get them so that you can see it. Does the same thing. There's no real easy way to do this, but you can see it from the top just as easily how the shadow from the column follows the shape of the cone. Because the cone is rounded on the side, the shadow from the column follows the shape of the cone. Where it's wider at the base than it is at the top. Right? So let's put those together. Let's put those together in a quick demonstration. Let's have us a sphere. Let's have us a cone. And let's have us a column. Just like that. And we're going to have the column in front of the cone and the cone in front of the sphere. So if we do our column, the way we did our column last week, and I'm going to go through this part real quick. If we do our column the way we did our column last week, we have our shadow here where the body of the column casts a shadow on itself. And then we have the reflected light. But we also have reflected light from this cone beside us. So this part down here is going to be lighter than the part up there. So we have reflected light from the surface. And then we have reflected light from the cone. So you see how they have effects on one another. And then we have the shadow underneath, where there's absolutely no light here at the base of the column, and the shadow is cast this way. And the shadow of our column is cast on our cone, and you get the reflection of that darker shadow on the edge. See it? That's the shadow of the column reflected on the cone. And then the cone will cast a shadow. This is where the body of the cone casts a shadow on itself. Just like we talked about in one of the previous lessons, the body of the cone casts a shadow on itself in the shape of a cone. So you've got the body of the cone casting a shadow on itself. Then you have this sphere behind it, which is casting a shadow, which is casting a reflection on the cone. So you've got reflected light over here that is darker on top than it is on bottom, because the sphere is reflecting light onto our cone. That is how they react to one another. The light from the sphere will reflect back onto the cone. The light from, and let me show you. Here's our cone. Here's our sphere. See it? Here's our cone. Here's our cone. See it? How they react back to each other is going to come into play next week when we talk about complex shapes like faces. So here's our cone. The shadow is darkest down here where there's absolutely no light, and then it's casting a shadow this way, and the shadow from our cone is in the shape of a cone, but it is cast on our sphere. So the shape of the cone goes around the body of the sphere, and the core shadow from the body of the cone is the darkest on the cast shadow on the sphere. And remember, there's one on the other side. When you look at it from above, you can see it. When we put that above, you can see there's a shadow here and there's a shadow here. So just like that, there's a shadow on both sides of this sphere where the reflection of the cone shadow is cast on the sphere, and then the backlit section of the cone is on the sphere also. So the shadow on the sphere reflects the shadow on the cone. And then you still have the transitional shadow and the shadow that the body casts on itself on the sphere. And the only reason you have a transitional shadow on this sphere is because the sphere in our example is styrofoam, and the texture casts a shadow on itself. And then you have the backlit shadow behind it. And then you have the darkest shadow is where there's no light at all. And then you have the shadow on the ground around it. See how they react to one another? When the shadow is cast on the opposing object, the shadow is in the shape of the cast object, but it follows the contours of the body it's shading. So while this shadow is a column, it follows the contour of the cone. While this shadow is a cone, it follows the contour of the body it's casting a shadow on. And the objects that it's shading reflect back into the backlight area. So, does that make sense? If that makes sense to everybody, then next week we can move into really cool things like faces and cars and trucks and airplanes and trees, and you can see how to go from draw a shape, add a spine, make a tree. Right? That is this week's $2 tutorial. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us for this week's $2 Tuesday tutorial. If you've enjoyed this $2 Tuesday tutorial, please check out theclassroom.artisticbiker.com for this and many more short tutorials, most starting at just $2, hence the name $2 tutorial. And thank you for your continued support.